Levine. Big round of applause for Bruce Levine.
A little bit of history. Among those of us who are critics of industrial psychiatry, or what I call institutional mental health, there's a piece of American history that you'll find us telling and retelling because we find it so relevant to today. I first saw this piece of history in a book by Stephen Jay Gould that came out in the early 1980s called The Mismeasure of Man. It's a book debunking biological determinism of intelligence and IQ and all that. And I've since seen this piece of history in books by Peter Bregan, Thomas Sass, Mike Males, Herb Cutchins and Stuart Kirk's book are showing the pseudoscience behind the DSM had it. I put it in Common Sense Rebellion, and a few months after my book came out, Robert Whitaker's book, Mad in America, which is also on that desk, describing the horrors of the treatment by American psychiatry of those labeled with schizophrenia and before that insanity. So first let me tell a piece of history and explain a little bit why we find it so relevant today, all of us. It's 1851. And the well-respected Louisiana physician, a guy named Dr. Samuel A. Cartwright, is studying runaway slaves. He's trying to figure out why they run away. I mean, after all, most of the slaves are not running away. And he figures out that they must have this disease, which he calls drapetomania. That's D-R-A-P-E-T-O mania. And this disease causes them to flee. And he writes in the well-respected New Orleans Medical and Surgical Journal, quotes, "What induces the Negro to run away is no less a species of mental alienation than any other, and much more curable." He's a very happy guy. And he goes on to say that, quotes, "With proper medical advice, strictly followed, this troublesome practice that many Negroes have of running away can be almost entirely prevented." And he turns out to be a behaviorist of sorts, an early behaviorist, and he recommends that these slaves be neither treated too leniently nor whipped too severely. Okay? Well, why do all of us find that so relevant for today? Well, it's not just history. It's today that you'll see doctors, especially psychiatrists, will see those out there who are rebelling against dehumanizing institutions as something to be labeled, something to be diagnosed. Okay? And also, what we'll see not just in history, but today probably more than ever, because the diagnostic labels have grown. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But probably more than ever today, than in history, what you'll see are doctors, especially psychiatrists and psychologists, who are ignoring social, political, economic context, okay? Or maybe just paying lip service to it. But ultimately, by doing that, they become folks who are just used to shore up institutions that either need to be completely reformed or in many cases just heaved out, like in the case of slavery. Okay? So of course when I say this to folks who are in institutional mental health, they say, well, 1851, what the heck is that? Why are you talking about that? So I say, okay, well, let's talk about the 20th century. After America's slavery problem, quotes, we had our, quotes, Indian problem. And you had the right wing in America were saying things, well, after they had done as much killing and exterminating as they possibly could, and Indians had given up, so you couldn't keep killing them outright, just put them on these reservations and hope eventually they'll just sort of die off and you can take that land too. Now, the left, the liberal shrink class said, oh no, you can't do that. We have to help them assimilate. And so they had things like boarding schools. Probably the most famous one in America is a Carlisle school. And again, through behavior modification techniques, kids were taken from their parents and, through starvation, whippings, induced not to use their language and their culture. This practice also went on in Canada, by the way, and they were called residential schools there. A good guy named Roland Christian, an Iroquois psychologist, has written about that in a book called The Circle Game. And I've listened to Roland talk about this, and what Roland says is, when I think about my enemies on the right, and I think about my so-called friends, on the left, his line was, I can handle my enemies, protect me from my friends. Okay? Well, again, folks in institutional mental health, they say, what are you doing? You're just stirring up things here. Why are you talking about all this stuff? This is all way before our DSM. Well, that's not true. That's not true, actually. This stuff went on when the DSM came out. The first DSM came out in 1952, but let's take a look at their DSM era. First DSM, 1952, homosexuality is a disease. Second DSM comes out in 1968. Homosexuality is still a disease. 1970s, interesting things were happening in this country, one of which was gay rights activists. Okay? Many of those gay rights activists were psychiatrists, and they didn't like being called diseased. And so probably in one of the most fierce battles ever in the American Psychiatric Association, they fought to overturn it, and when the DSM-3 came out in 1980, no longer was homosexuality a disease. Okay? And the important thing to remember here is this, is that it was never put in for scientific reasons, never taken out for scientific reasons. Pure politics. Okay? And that's really, although it's a lot more difficult to see with some of these other diagnoses, but that's also the case. We're talking about politics, culture. We're not talking about science. Okay? Again, folks in industrial, institutional mental health, they say like, you're just a troublemaker. I mean, we don't do that kind of stuff anymore. We don't diagnose people based on their race or their ethnicity or their sexual preference. Well, it's not quite totally true, but superficially, okay, that is true. But what's happened here is we have that DSM has grown dramatically. It's gotten so silly that even Newsweek, mainstream Newsweek, did a story in 1998 called "Is Everybody Crazy?" making fun of this DSM. And what they did is they went back in that first 1952 DSM and they counted 60 diagnoses. And then they went in the current DSM-4 and they counted 410 diagnoses. And what they didn't say in the article is where the new diagnosis, what population, where the new diagnoses were coming from the most. And that's kids, teenagers, okay? Kids, small children. So, that first DSM 1952, there was no ADD, no attention deficit disorder, no attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Nowadays, I don't even have to say what it is, right? It's a household term. Everybody knows what this stuff is. By the 1970s, you had about 250,000 kids in America on these Ritalin-like drugs. Adderalls, amphetamine, dexedrine, these are all these kind of Ritalin-like drugs that are used for ADD. Today we have, in America, just in America, we have 4 million to 6 million kids on these Ritalin-like drugs. All right? Another diagnosis, a kid diagnosis that some of you may not have heard of, but you will, because it's rivaling in popularity ADD, is something called ODD, which stands for Oppositional Defiant Disorder. And your reaction, you'll feel good about this, I think you'll feel good about this, is your reaction is the reaction I get everywhere I go, including when I go on media. And talk radio show hosts, didn't happen the other day, we didn't talk about it, but when I bring that up with other talk radio hosts, they always stop and they go, what is that oppositional defiant disorder? As they say, if they're AM guys, they're a little bit more low-key if they're FM. And so I rattle off the symptoms. I mean, how you get this. In that DSM, there's a checklist, behavioral checklist. All these disorders are diagnosed with these behavioral checklists in the DSM. And so you have to have 4 of the following bunch of symptoms for more than 6 months, okay? You have to often be angry with adults, often argue with adults, often refuse to comply with adults, often be irritated by adults, often throw temper tantrums, and goes on and on. All you need is 4. And so when I say that, a talk show host, lots of times, will just interrupt after I've said a couple and go, that ODD sounds like me, they say. They're proud of it. And these guys are hip. I mean, they guys know their audience. And they know that their audience is out there thinking, like, this doesn't sound like a disorder. It just sounds like a teenager. It sounds like a kind of a spirited kid. And, and they kind of like want to view themselves as being rebellious, a lot of these guys. And so they're making a joke about this. Well, it's no laughing matter in industrial psychiatry. I mean, these kids are getting drugged for this, okay? So what I want to talk about here today is pretty much what the book is. A little bit about whether this huge expansion in this mental health business, the diagnoses, the drugs, is this really about science? Or is this about marketing, drug company marketing? That's one aspect. The second thing I want to talk about here is is there maybe even a bigger problem than a pseudoscience and drug company corruption, which is that this huge medicalizing of our unhappiness is distracting us, diverting us from taking a look at a society that in many ways has grown incredibly dehumanizing. And the third thing I want to get to is solutions, alternative solutions, what I call common sense rebellion, rehumanizing our life, alternative solutions to silly behavioral manipulations, and more drugs. That's what psychiatry, that's what medicine does these days, okay? So let me start with the first thing, marketing. What do we know about what's going on out there with drug companies and marketing? Well, we know from Families USA, which is a consumer group, they did a survey a little while back, and they said that drug companies spend twice, many cases 3 times as much on advertising and marketing than they do on any kind of research and development, okay? And, people have to understand these drug companies, they like Pfizer, for example, who makes Zoloft, make dwarf Microsoft. I mean, these are gigantic corporations with lots of power to do a lot of things. And so those commercials you see on television, which really started around 1997 for these drugs, those are really just the tip of the marketing iceberg, okay? The iceberg itself is billions were spent before and continue to be spent even more marketing directly to doctors, okay? And also seeking control over the major mental health institutions. Okay, let me just go through a few. We could be here all day talking about how all of this works. But let me just go through a couple of examples to give you an idea of how this happens. One thing drug companies have done for a long time is have a vast army of drug representatives that goes knocking on doctors' doors. In America today, there's 82,000 of these folks for about 750,000 doctors. Vast army goes knocking on these doctors' doors. Many of these are attractive women, attractive men who have free samples, have dinners for these doctors, maybe theater tickets, very charming folks. You talk to doctors about these folks, they'll go, I know what these guys are doing. We take their free lunches. We don't listen to what they have to say. Well, one thing you need to know is that drug companies are not, there are a lot of things, but they're not stupid. They spend millions to make billions, just like every other corporation. If something doesn't work, they don't continue doing it, all right? But that's really just the infantry, and it may well be true. There are some doctors who just kind of just don't listen, and they feel like they've won the sales resistance game here. But these drug companies are smart, and they know we're sending more waves than that at them. And so a real significant thing that they do, and there was an article about this a little while back, a few months back in the Washington Post, about what they do is they take doctors to some of the fanciest hotels in America. This article is about the Plaza. Rooms there at least $250 a night, Plaza in New York. And then, they give them free meals, let them stay overnight. They listen to a drug representative talk for a few hours. And then at the end, they're given checks. Many as high as, in this article, talking about $2,000 checks. Champagne, limousines. Again, you confront doctors after they come out of these things and say, they're bribing you guys. I'll go, nah, we're doctors. That can work with other people, but we're doctors. This doesn't work on us. We can go and we listen. We don't even listen. We think about other things and we make our money. Again, not only does it just sort of violate common sense of business. Business people know, you take something, you're beholden to them. You're more likely to do it. But we know from studies. That when doctors go to these kinds of things, they're more likely to prescribe. And again, drug companies are not stupid. All right. What else goes on? Well, in addition to drug companies spending lots of money on just about every drug study that you ever hear of is drug companies funded. The vast majority of these drugs that are approved by FDA, drug studies that have been controlled by drug companies, are the studies that are used. A lot of people don't know that. I think FDA does independent research. It's not true. FDA is supposed to look at it independently. What else? Research. If you go through any kind of medical journal, especially psychiatry journal, they're just filled with page after page of drug company advertising. And so they could not really exist nowadays without drug company money. So every level, institutions that are controlled by drug companies, just about every famous mental health institution that you've ever heard of, okay, not Support Coalition International, but just about every other one is going to be drug company funded. American Psychiatric Association, which is the professional guild which publishes the DSM, have taken millions of dollars from drug companies. Now, when you confront them, again, and this is a quote I have in Common Sense Rebellion, a guy was confronted who's a director, a medical director there at the American Psychiatric Association. He says, it's a no-strings relationship. You know, drug companies, they have a fiduciary relationship with their shareholders. They can't give out millions of dollars without strings being attached. That's the game. That's the way corporate America works. They've also given millions of dollars to so-called consumer organizations, National Alliance for the Mentally Ill. Mother Jones did an expose. So did Mind Freedom Journal, had the copies of the checks that went from these drug companies, over $11 million between 1996 and mid-1999, from drug companies to the National Alliance for Mentally Ill, NAMI it's called. They take care of other consumer groups too. What else? Government agencies. Again, if you know anything about the way the defense contractors or agribusinesses work, military-industrial complexes, you don't have to reinvent the wheel here. It's the same game. Of course, you can't write a check to somebody who's in a government position, but what you do is you make it clear that, hey, when you leave, if you've been friendly to us, nice job's waiting for you, okay? And that's what happens. I talk about in Common Sense Rebellion about a guy from National Institute of Mental Health, scientific director. When he leaves his post in 1993, he writes this article praising drug companies in the Wall Street Journal. Next stop for this guy, vice presidency of Eli Lilly, makers of Prozac. Okay, this legal corruption, that's what I call it. I mean, it's like legal, but it's corrupt, I think. It's gotten so bad that The Lancet, which is one of the most well-respected journals in the world out of the UK, they have called America's FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, they've called it the quotes, the servants of the drug industry. Okay? Okay, so what are they trying to do? What are these drug companies trying to do? Well, they're certainly trying to get everybody to buy more of their product, right? That's what corporations do. But what's important for them to have in everybody's head, in the public's head, to make this easy for them? Well, it's important for them that everybody believes that it's a proven fact that all of these mental diagnoses, or at least the major ones like depression and ADD, it's been proven that they're caused by some chemical imbalance, some chemical brain imbalance. You hear this over and over again like it's a fact. It's not. It's theory, okay? So I say that to folks and they go, wait a minute, I've heard this from here, I heard this from here, I heard this from here. I say, well, check the funding. You might have just really heard it from one place, you know? Let's talk about ADD, all right, a little bit. We can go through depression or any of these things, but let's talk a little bit about this biochemical brain imbalance for ADD. National Institute of Health, 1998, has come right out and said, hey, you know, when you diagnose these kids, there's no biological markers to use. You know, there's no proof of anything physiological or biological. American Academy of Pediatrics, the year 2000, instructing their pediatricians around America how to diagnose this ADD, ADHD. Says, again, no biological markers. Okay, when I tell this to folks, I say, wait a minute, how are we going to check this out? You say this, I don't know. Everybody else is saying this biochemical brain imbalance. And I just tell folks, just go to your doctor. Go to your doctor and say, hey, I want to know, you know, what the lab test is, what the physical exam is for ADD. I want to know, you know, what's the blood test, what's the EEG, what's the brain scan. I want to know. Well, unless the guy's a complete quack, unless your doctor, unless you're a complete quack, they'll say there is none. There's no lab test. There's no physical exam. So how is this diagnosed? Well, it's diagnosed through these behavioral checklists, like I described for ODD, the one for ADD as, you know, often disorganized, often forgets things, those kinds of things. You have to understand these behavioral checklists are incredibly unreliable. Okay, and we know that from studies, that you'll see doctors disagree, you'll see teachers disagree on these checklists. I see them all the time in my clinical practice. You know, I can tell which teacher likes a kid and which teacher doesn't. The one teacher that doesn't check off any of these things, you know, usually kind of likes the kid, and the kid likes that teacher, and the teacher, the other, you know, who doesn't like the kid, they're checked off on all of these things. There's even disagreement among parents on these checklists. Okay, why? Because, you know, when not only do you have the subjective use of language, so one clinician sees a kid who, you know, they say is often arguing and often, you know, non-compliant, and I see the kid as like spirited. You know, but besides that, what happens is, and this really upsets a lot of these folks in institutional mental health, is that, you know what? People, kids, they're not machines. and they behave differently around different people. This is very upsetting for them. So there's no real reliability in any of these diagnoses. And so here's the secret. Whenever you hear, and you'll hear it over and over again, maybe as you go out tomorrow on the news, chromosome number 8 is associated with OCD, ODD, ADD, or whatever the heck, it's all goofy. Because they can't make a reliable diagnosis to begin with to associate things with anything, like you can when you're diagnosing a malignant, cancer, or you can with diabetes. There's things that you can reliably diagnose, okay? But not any of these things, right? So one of the deep, dark secrets of institutional mental health that they don't want people to know about. It's a house of cards, scientifically, all right? Let me spend a little bit of time, I end up, if folks heard the radio show yesterday, or a lot of radio shows, I end up spending maybe too much time talking about the drug issue, but I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the so-called science of these psychiatric drugs, all right? And sometimes I talk about Ritalin and what the heck, we'll talk about the SSRIs and talk about antidepressants here today. We can talk about some of the other stuff later if you're interested. What do we know about the history of antidepressant drugs in America? Well, it starts really with Freud and cocaine. And if you read, and I have it in the depression chapter in Common Sense Rebellion, Freud's quotes about his using cocaine, they sound identical to like Peter Kramer's praise of Prozac and listening to Prozac and all folks who are saying how wonderful each psychiatric drug is. To Freud's credit, after he got himself and a friend or two addicted to the stuff, he said, "Oops, I guess this stuff's not so good." It's a real interesting thing. I'm not going to get too technical here, but I think it's important for you to know that cocaine affects the neurotransmitters dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine. All right? Just a real quick thing, in maybe 2 minutes here, you might know more than your family practitioner or general practitioner about how these drugs work. Just a couple of minutes here on this stuff. Okay, so what are transmitters of these other antidepressants work? Well, the next wave of antidepressants were these things like tofranil and Elavil. They're called tricyclics. Well, they affect norepinephrine and serotonin. Then the idea came along, this selective serotonin, we'll just get a drug that's clean, that affects only one of these neurotransmitters, and then we'll tell the world that depression is caused by the neurochemical imbalance of serotonin. Okay, and so this wave of SSRIs, Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, Prozac was the first one, came out in 1988, and Paxil, Zoloft, Lovix, Celexa. But an interesting thing happened. After we were all, told for sure serotonin was the cause of our depression, then something interesting happened. You had things like Effexor hit the market. And Effexor affected norepinephrine and serotonin. And it was like, more is better. It's not just if we could have something, this is Prozac with a punch, it was marketed as. And then they came out with Wellbutrin. Wellbutrin affects dopamine. But here's the interesting thing. It's not uncommon for me to see people out there who are on an Effexor, which affects serotonin and norepinephrine, and Wellbutrin, which affects dopamine. And so here we are, dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine. We're back to cocaine. These guys don't really know what they're talking about on a lot of ways, and it becomes clearer and clearer. Let me talk about how effective and how dangerous these drugs are. The whole history of psychiatric drugs, from the Thorazine era from the cocaine era to the all of these drugs, they're brought onto the market with this wonderful fanfare and then we're told how the last class of drugs were really horrible, and these were good, they're not addicting, they're not dangerous, and they're wonder drugs. This has been happening every 10, 20 years as long as psychiatric drugs are around. And so that's when we heard, when the SSRIs hit the market, Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, we heard how horrible, the drugs were before that, the Elavil and the tofranil. We heard all their horrible side effects. Well, now the patents have run out on Prozac, okay? And they're starting to run out on the others. And so now, slowly seeping into mainstream psychiatry, things that folks who are real critics, who knew what was going on, were talking about 10 years ago, about how problematic these things, how ineffective they really were. So 10 years ago, folks like Seymour Fisher and Roger Greenberg were talking about a lot of this, all these antidepressants, these SSRIs included, is just like a placebo effect. No, people weren't listening to them. They were marginalized. Well, real interesting study just came out, April 10th, Journal of American Medical Association. And the goal, really, of the study was to show, they don't say it like this, but it's pretty obvious, it was to show that St. John's wort was ineffective, was no more effective than a placebo. And the folks who did the research, were owned stock in Pfizer, which makes Zoloft, and they were paid consultants for Pfizer, okay? But something really weird happened. As much as they designed this study to work to show that Zoloft would be the best and placebo and St. John's wort would be equally ineffective, something interesting happened. Well, the Zoloft, the placebo turned out to be better than both the St. John's wort and the Zoloft. The Zoloft, but what happens is when you read Newsweek and you look at the clippings in the AP Wire, you only hear, well, St. John's wort was ineffective, was as effective as a placebo, was ineffective. But if you look at the study, it's real easy to see. St. John, the Zoloft didn't do as well as a placebo. Okay? So some people say, okay, so what? But so what? Maybe it's not, it doesn't, it's not so great, but it works for some people. I have a friend or I have a neighbor that their life changed. It's wonderful. And I say, well, do these folks know the risk they're taking when they're taking any of these psychiatric drugs? All of these drugs affect those basic neurotransmitters. They're always either trying to enhance those neurotransmitters I talked about, or they're trying to shut them down. And when you do that, you're always playing havoc with the body. And almost always you hear down the road, there's all kinds of problems. And that's what we're hearing now. Folks like Peter Bregan, whose book is over there, 10 years ago was talking in that Toxic Psychiatry about problems, neurological problems that you're going to have when you're using these SSRIs. Well, now mainstream psychiatry is going, oops, I guess we were wrong. I guess there are some problems. Joe Glenmullen, Harvard psychiatrist, Prozac prescriber, is saying straight out, we're seeing neurological disturbances indicating, quotes, potential brain damage from these SSRIs. He's saying 50% of people who take these drugs, when they try to go off of them, have debilitating withdrawals. Okay? Flu-like symptoms, dizziness, that kind of thing. They even have a term for it now. Even institutional mental health has a term for this withdrawal. It's what I consider, an amazingly Orwellian term. They don't call it withdrawal. They call it antidepressant discontinuation syndrome. Okay. What I want to do is I want to move on, okay, to some material that, for me is in some ways closer to my heart, okay, because there's a lot of great books, and some of them are back there, that talk about the pseudoscience, talk about these validity, reliability, drug ineffectiveness, drug company, corruption, all of those things. And I wanted to summarize a lot of that for folks to have access to in Common Sense Rebellion. But I wanted to move to the next level, and that's what I want to do here, which is I think that those problems, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, are going to be viewed at maybe as minor compared to a more major problem, which is that I think that people are going to look back at this era and say, like, this huge medicalization of our unhappiness, of our misery, is distracting us, diverting us from taking a look at a society and a culture that in many ways has just grown incredibly dehumanizing, as it's grown exponentially materially, at least for some of us here in America. And, for folks out there who are just still thinking, I still think it's a lot of genetic, biochemical, just a couple of facts. What no one disagrees with, including the Surgeon General, no radical here, is that compared to 30 years ago, we've got the rate of overweight children in America is double compared to 30 years ago. The rate of teen suicides, teen boy suicides compared to the 1960s is triple. Compared to the 1950s, it's 4 times as high today. You can go through every kind of self-destructive behavior, every kind of disorder, and you'll see huge increases in the last 30 years, huge increases since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, huge increases even since 1900. A former president of the American Psychological Association says we have a 10-fold increase in the rate of depression between 1900 and now. It's 10 times higher today. You just go on these numbers. So what the heck is going on here in this culture, in this society, that psychiatrists, psychologists are either just paying lip service to or totally ignoring, not dealing with? And for me, we could probably be here, everybody here probably has some good ideas on this. But let me just talk about a few things that I think are huge. One of them is our culture, our society, has become a one-dimensional, consumeristic culture, okay? It is the religion of America. Christianity is around, but I think I could prove here that consumerism is the primary religion. I think I could do it. I mean, what are the commandments of consumerism? The consumerism commandments are, thou shalt expand materially on a private level, on a corporate level, always should be growing and expanding. Thou shalt be efficient, thou shalt be productive, thou shalt rub out anything that gets in the way of growth, efficiency, productivity. Okay? Now, I say, I've seen politicians, I've been around for a while, they break the 10 Commandments left and right, they get reelected. You'll never see a politician speak out against those commandments. You'll never see it happen. Those are the commandments. Now, some people say, well, so you're against all material things? No. What I'm against is one-dimensionality. Because what happens when you have a one-dimensional culture, all kinds of things are eliminated. And lots of important things that are necessary for people's mental health are just given short shrift. They're just not talked about. They're just not part of our culture. Few things that are huge, that are important, that people have fought and died for thousands of years that nobody even talks about in this culture anymore. One thing, autonomy. Some real control over your life, some degree of self-determination, some decision-making, some experience of potency. Real democracy. Okay? Second thing, community. Genuine community, not this bogus world, global community kinds of, silly terms, or real face-to-face community. Economic, emotional interdependencies, okay? People have called these things for years by different terms, but have been always powerful. Liberty, fraternity, okay? When we were on our way out here, my wife and I, we stopped at Pine Ridge, and we went over there at the Wounded Knee Memorial, and AIM, American Indian Movement, had on their wall their S's. I'll go through a couple of their S's here. It was sovereignty and support. So everybody for thousands of years have known these are what it's all about. Some autonomy, some community. People have also known what it's about is fighting for diversity. Fighting for their humanity. And again, folks say, what do you mean? We're increasingly diverse. We have Joe Lieberman running for vice president. We have, Colin Powell, Secretary of State. Yeah. What's happened is we've had some slight increase in tolerance racially, religiously, is that incredible increase for me in intolerance for different kind of personalities, different cognitive styles, less and less of a place for these folks in the workplace, okay, and in culture at large. All of that's part of our mental health. What else? Another huge thing that I talk about in Common Sense Rebellion, at least huge for me, is the issue of institutionalization. And I'm going to define what I mean by that in a second. But this institutionalization, it goes on so much around us that we can't even see it, okay? It occurs in our big corporations where we shop, where we work. It occurs in our big governments, in our big, in media, hospitals, school. And what this institutionalization is the growth of these gigantic entities that are bureaucratic, impersonal, okay? In many cases, they're hierarchical, coercive, manipulative, okay? And what do? They leave us feeling small, alienated, isolated, disconnected. They leave us feeling enraged a lot. 1 out of 4 of us, according to Putnam, sociologist out of Harvard, feel enraged on the job. They leave us feeling helpless and hopeless, bored, too. Lots of bored folks out there. And these are the ingredients for our emotional difficulties, our self-destructive behaviors, our interpersonal problems. And this is what we should be focusing in on, not serotonin levels, norepinephrine levels, all this kind of stuff. Okay, let me make this stuff a little bit more concrete. Because I've got chapters on ADD and on depression and all these kinds of things. But for me, important chapters in the book are things like on jobs. Which again, if you talk to a lot of mental health professionals, always say, oh, jobs are real important. It's important this and that. but again, pay lip service that a job is not a job is not a job. What you do, what kind of job matters, okay? And so what do we have in America here today? We hear all kind of high-tech booms, but according to the U.S. Department of Labor, between 1994, they projected this in 94, through the year 2005, the 4 leading jobs are going to be, number one, each one of these about 500,000 new jobs. Number 1 job is going to be cashiers. Number 2 job, janitors and maids. Number 3 job, retail clerks. Number 4 job, waiters and waitresses. Number 9 at the time were guards. This is after, September 11th, I've probably moved up. Guards are probably, I don't know, maybe 5 now or something. How is this happening? What the heck is going on? And one of the things that's happening here is this huge Walmartization of America, Starbuckization, Barnes and Nobleization. And, folks who are like institutional economists, they say we've had great unemployment up until recently, very low. What's your problem? What are you talking about all this stuff for? And, those owner-operators that you love so much and those family farmers that America wiped out a long time ago, I mean, these guys, they worked their butts off, and, they didn't get paid that much, okay? So I said, okay, well, you're forgetting a couple of things. Let me tell you what those folks had, and even more so indigenous cultures, okay? Nature-based cultures. But even these folks, owner-operators, family farmers, what they had was autonomy. They got to make some decisions. They got to use their brain. They got to make bad decisions, okay, even. They got to be creative. They got to learn things. Huge antidote to mental difficulties in life that my business just doesn't talk about anymore. What else did they have? These folks had community, real genuine community. You can go through a lot in life, a lot of hard knocks, a lot of horrible things when you've got genuine support, okay? Huge antidote to mental difficulties. What else? I mean, these people also had meaning. Meaning, what they did, they felt mattered in life, all right? Now, what do we know about people in America today on the job? We know that, according to the International Center of Technology Assessment, about 80% of us, when questioned in studies, say what we do for a living is utterly meaningless. Okay? And these are not just your cashiers and your clerks and your waiters. These are more and more people like teachers. I mean, I see them, I talk with them. You've got this institutionalizing of testing. You have, in the last election, I saw these guys, Bush and, Gore. One guy said, these kids need to be tested, and the other guy said, well, they need to be tested more. You're wrong. I mean, it was like... And you talk to your third-grade teachers out there who are like spending their time not expanding these kids' minds, or being creative, but worried about, how well these kids are going to do on proficiency exams, or else they're going to get their butts fired. Healthcare. I know that real well. Lots of folks in healthcare, dealing with HMOs, managed care. It's humiliating. I've done it. Schmoozing the managed care police to make sure your client gets benefits. And so you're seeing this kind of thing happening all over. And, what I argue for, and I go through in Comments Rebellion, these are key things that this huge medicalization are diverting us from taking a look at our culture and from our society. Okay? What I want to do is get to probably the most important thing, though, is solutions. Let me talk a little bit about what I mean by rehumanizing our lives and common sense rebellion, because that's really the core of the book and the core of a lot of what I am. I mean, mostly what I've done in my life besides writing has been in private practice. And so, one of the things you learn that you don't really learn so well in kind of academia if you're just kind of writing alone and isolated from people, writers want to believe that, if only you tell the truth, the truth is going to set people free, and that's all what it's about. But if you're out there in the world, and especially if you're working clinically, is you see, what? People are pretty smart. They may not know all the facts that I've described, but at some core level, they know a lot of stuff. They certainly know their area. But what you see a lot is that the problem is not that they don't know certain things. is that the problem is that people are demoralized. They're dispirited, broken. And the really sad thing for me was that in all the years of my going for training, and this was even in the late 70s and early 80s when I was in graduate school, and it's gotten much worse today, the terms, in terms of talking about people, like not having any meaning in their life, or being dispirited, or being broken, or being demoralized, it was almost never brought up. And this is what you see all the time if you're really looking at people without thinking about labels and diagnoses. Whether somebody's depressed or they're having alcohol problems, lots of times is they're not stupid. They're just broken, okay? So a huge part of what I think about all the time, what I think about clinically, when I'm in practice, but when I thought about writing this book was like, well, what do you do about that? Okay? Now, so in the book, I have in each chapter, I have specific solutions, and if people have people thumbing through it, they see bulleted, lots of suggestions, and there's a lot of how-to kind of specifics, but what I know for myself and for people that I know, it's a lot of how you get your morale restored are examples, models. And they don't have to be gigantic models of people changing the world, okay? Very hard to do nowadays. Even changing NAMI, National Alliance for Mentally Ill, or American Psychiatric Association, very hard to change even these gigantic institutions. But there's a lot of neat things that have been going on, what I call human scale. And one of the heroes of Common Sense Rebellion is author of a human scale, a guy named Kirkpatrick Sale, and that's in the Mass Society chapter. So what I want to talk about a little bit here today are some human scale examples, okay, of Common Sense Rebellion. One of my favorites that I like to talk about comes from the education chapter, and it's about a guy named Elliot Wigginton. Now, this guy, Elliot, he graduated Cornell in the late 1960s, and he was going to be a do-gooder. He was going to go down to Appalachia and teach English. And he's there for 2 weeks, and there's total chaos. Nobody's listening to a word he's saying. These kids are they stole his chalk. He can't even write on the blackboard. He set fire to his lectern. These kids, almost his whole class would have been diagnosed with ADD or ODD or conduct disorder or something. And Elliot, he was hurt. He was really hurt. And he was frustrated, and he was angry, and he was depressed, and these kids were bored, and it was just miserable. Okay, and so his first reaction, being institutionally trained, was, I'm going to suspend these kids, or at least the really bad kids. But he doesn't do it. He doesn't do it, and he has what I call a common sense light bulb or an epiphany or whatever you want to call it. And I want to talk about what that is, what ended up happening. But before I get to the end of the story, just a couple of things about what I mean by Common Sense Rebellion. What people have known for thousands of years, and only modern mental health movement of psychiatry and psychology has forgotten pieces of wisdom that everybody has known forever, which is that when people are experiencing, negative emotions, hurt, anger, frustration, boredom, and they're overwhelmed by those feelings, they do stupid things. We all do. I do. Everybody in this room does. Okay? And, what the job really of any kind of parent, teacher, friend is, for me, not to try to behaviorally manipulate, throw somebody with carrots and sticks to try to make them act a certain way, or certainly not to try to extinguish their valid pain with some kinds of drugs. The job of a helper is to try to have somebody feel that their pain is heard, it's understood, it's cared about, and often that alone frees people up to get back their own common sense and their own brain, and you don't even have to give them any kind of counsel. It happens all the time. I know I'm going to get back to the story in a second, but just one thing. I made a promise to a young man when I left Cincinnati. We were sitting around one day and we were talking about this thing of what I'm talking about. And he said, well, what do you call that? What do you professionals call it? He says, well, I said, they used to call it empathy or validation or something like that. And we both went, You know why? Because these people, media, politicians, corporate folks, they've ruined those words. It's just manipulative now. I mean, they just use like empathy to manipulate people or validation to manipulate. So we said we need to come up with a new word to describe the real deal of what we're talking about. You know, really validating, caring about somebody to kind of like liberate them, to get back their own brain. So he looked at me and says, well, what word? You know, what word would we come up with? I said, well, here's an idea. You know, if you want people to remember this word, think the drug companies, they always make sure to have a Z or an X in their new drugs. Or, you know, Zyprexa has them both, you know, but all of them, and they're marketing guys, all they're thinking about, those names have nothing to do with anything, but they stick in people's heads because people are not used to Z or X words. So he said, okay. So we sat down and we came up with the word Zyro. And that was going to be the new word for the real deal of validating and caring about who somebody really was to kind of free them up. So he said, we're going to spread that word around, Zyro. Back to the story, back to the Wigginton story. All right, so he goes back into the classroom, and he looks out to see of bored, irritated, annoyed kind of faces, and he says to them, we're going to throw out lectures. We're going to throw out your worksheets, these goofy worksheets, textbooks, to heck with it. So, of course, these kids, their first reaction was, yay, we throw the Ivy League boy over the top, we flipped them out, you know, they're empowered, you know, but not in a great way. So Elliot, he's reading them, he's seeing them, he's going, no, we're really going to start to learn now. He says, we're going to form a magazine, and I want you to go out and talk to your parents, your grandparents, your uncles, your aunts, neighbors, and I want you to find out what these folks know how to do, what their wisdom is. And so these kids, it's interesting, a lot of these so-called bad kids, these disruptive kids, they love doing things like that. They love going out and interviewing, especially they could go tell their parents this is homework. So they went out and did it. They went out and did it, and they found out all kinds of neat things. They found out, you know, how to build a log cabin from scratch, and how to preserve vegetables and preserve fruit, and how to make soap from scratch, and home health remedies. And lots of neat things happened, some of which Elliot hoped for, some of which he didn't even imagine were going to happen. First thing that he didn't even imagine was going to happen was all of a sudden you had an older generation who was feeling useful again. Like somebody was actually listening to what they had to say, which you need to understand, you know, in consumeristic culture, that's exactly the opposite of what we want to have happen. You want to always make what's old, the older generation, worthless, the present generation not so good, the future the better. That's how you planned obsolescence, lots of stuff, you know, folks, one of the advertising common sense rebels of the book, a guy named Jerry Mander, some of you might have heard of. And that's just the way those guys think. You always want to make the old bad, which means you make older generations worthless and you break down community. All right? So one thing, that was one thing he hadn't even imagined was going to happen. The second thing that he hadn't thought about happened was all of a sudden these kids, their self-esteem improved. It was like, hey, our culture here, our Appalachian culture is pretty neat. You know, it was like, you know, here these kind of kids were being told, and you know, by folks especially in cities, you know, like they were white trash. That's what they were called. They didn't feel that anymore. They felt pretty good. Third thing that happened is what Elliot had hoped would happen, which was that these kids now had a reason to listen to him. When he told them their writing made no sense, it was like, it was incoherent. And, you know, their spelling was off. And they had a reason to listen. He could be an English teacher again. And, you know, they also learned typing and layout design, and they learned fundraising, okay, many other kinds of skills that went to putting together a magazine. What else happened? Well, this magazine became so successful it got turned into a book. And the book became so successful it became an internationally acclaimed series of books. And it's called the Foxfire. Foxfire. So some of you might have seen that in used bookstores. Fantastic kind of series of books. Lots of other Common Sense Rebellion examples besides Support Coalition International, which is in Common Sense Rebellion, down the road, down south, Fresno, the Kevin McReady's, you know, San Joaquin. Lots of neat things are happening. But I want to tell a story that's really, really small scale. It's almost, it's just almost a small interpersonal kind of interaction. But I want to tell it for a few reasons. Because it was my first experience I just kind of happened into of what I call Common Sense Rebellion. And I also want to tell it because I was a junior partner with somebody who was psychiatrically hospitalized in a locked mental ward. This person was the senior partner in the Common Sense Rebellion. And the other reason why I want to tell is a lot of people think like, well, you're a psychologist and you're just trashing psychiatry and drugs. And this story, the Common Sense Rebellion, is not against psychiatry or drugs. It's against psychology and behavior modification manipulations, all right? So that's why I want to tell this story. It's 1976, and I'm an undergraduate. I'm 20 years old, and I want to get into graduate school. That's what I'm thinking at that point in my life. And I was a good, compliant boy of sorts, and I got my A's, and I did good on these little standardized tests. But it was pretty competitive back in those days, and so folks were telling me you had to have experience too. And so I found out that there was this class that you could take. You could get an easy A, and you just volunteer at some institution around town, some mental health institution. So I volunteered at a place in New York called Creedmoor, which was their famous, in Queens, their famous psychiatric hospital. And when I went in there, it was 1976, so it was like a year after One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest had come out, which I guess was filmed up the road here, right in Salem. And so in a state hospital, and I looked at that place. The first time I'd been in a locked ward in a psychiatric hospital, and it was identical to what I'd seen in the movie in Cuckoo's Nest. There was that, there's that TV mounted, in the big day room that everybody was kind of staring at. A lot of people with a lot of drugs and sort of like zombified, and some people doing some strange things, and some people just wandering around. And there was that big nurse's station, that Nurse Ratched was behind. There was no one as colorful as Nurse Ratched in this thing, but there was all the staff was behind this big window, and they never came out really, except to kind of hand pills and these little paper cups of water to folks. And it was an interesting kind of experience for me being 20 years old, because no one really cared what happened there. I mean, what they cared about is that, these patients didn't fight with one another and that they didn't kill each other. That's really all they cared about. And so, no one really cared what I did much either. And so I pretty much just hung out. And some of these folks, I couldn't really connect with, but there was a couple of these folks who were patients who I thought were really cool. I mean, I thought they were really interesting. And, there's nobody as cool as like that Indian guy but there was one guy that was kind of close in the sense that you could see how smart he was. You could just look at him. He never said anything, but you could just see his eyes. He was thinking about stuff. And he was this guy, I call him in the book, and George, and he was diagnosed with just some severe depression. They were just drugging him to make sure he didn't get agitated enough to actually kill himself. That was the sort of what the plan was for him. But one day, well, let me just say this. I mean, George, the thing about George was he didn't talk to anyone, really, at all. And I would just go over to the pool table there, and these pool tables in these places were in pretty bad shape. I mean, most of the balls would be missing, and you really couldn't play a great game, but you'd mess around on them. And that's what I did, and George would come over and join me, and out of nowhere, he would sort of say a few things every once in a while. Well, somehow word got back to the staff. This was a big deal. George had said some things to me. And so my psychologist boss, he sat me down, and he said, I hear George is saying things to you. I hear George is behaving pro-socially, and he needs to be rewarded because we have a token economy here. Well, I knew what that pro-social stuff was. I knew that. But I said to him, what do you mean? He said, well, George, he likes to smoke. Most of these folks like to smoke. Why? Because they're taking Thorazine and Haldol, which dampens all their dopamine. They're just trying to get some dopamine back in them with the cigarettes. And so, so they use cigarettes as rewards in their token economy. And so he said to me, you need to give George a cigarette for speaking, for acting pro-socially. And I said, well, wait a minute. I mean, this is humiliating. I mean, George is 50 years old. I'm 20 years old. I'm going to give him a cigarette for, talking with me? Wow. It was my first experience of dealing with some psychologist or psychiatrist who was sort of walking along in some kind of phlegmatic, sort of flat sort of state, watching them just all of a sudden come alive, angrily. I mean, I got this guy really upset. And he said, basically, if you don't do it, you're off the ward. Well, here's the interesting thing in terms of Common Sense Rebellion. Because I was 20, and because this didn't seem like that big a deal, it seemed like, well, I could get one of these volunteer experiences somewhere else. I wasn't that dependent on this. my brain was working pretty good here. I feel like, well, we'll see what we could do here. And I got to tell you, wisdom does not come with age sometimes, because 3, 4 years later, when I'd be in the middle of graduate school, getting my doctorate and feeling incredibly dependent on some idiot telling me what to do, I probably would have become so enraged that I probably would not have thought as well. So, one of the kind of tenets of common sense rebellion is trying your best you can to not be dependent on like insane situations, and knowing that if you are, your brain's probably not going to work that great. But I wasn't that dependent. So I thought about it, and I realized one of the good cards I had in my hand, maybe the only good card, was, that staff, they were going to watch what I did. They were going to watch me giving that cigarette, but they weren't going to hear what I had to say. They never came out from behind the glass. So I went over to George, and I said, George, here's a story. I told him a story, and I said, what should I do? And he looked at me, and like that, he just said, don't worry about it, we'll win. So I looked at him, and he said, give me the cigarette. And he said, but make sure they can see you. Make sure they can see you. So, I turned sideways, and he was over there. And, I took the cigarette, out, and, I handed it, to him. And so he took the cigarette from me, and he waved it. He waved it at me, with this look, I just thought I was kind of cool. And then this is what George did. He took the cigarette, and he went over to somebody, another patient who was sitting in just kind of like some frozen position like that, and he took the cigarette, and he put it in that person's pocket. And then he turned back to them with this look of contempt. It was just beautiful. I mean, I was like, I'll never forget that look. And I remember at the time, this was like, again, 1976, if you were an undergraduate, the big psychologist in America was a guy named B.F. Skinner. And every undergraduate was just, almost every undergraduate was assigned books like Beyond Freedom and Dignity. What kind of title? Beyond Freedom and Dignity. No one was saying anything about it. This is like, what's this, totalitarian dream? And I remember thinking at the time, and I still think it, I was going like, B.F. Skinner at Harvard, he might be beyond dignity, but not George. Not George. Okay? I want to take some questions and some comments, but just a couple more things before I finish. A lot about what Common Sense Rebellion really is connecting, not just connecting people and community, but reconnecting ourselves. And a lot of what society does, and even academia, is divide us. Divide us, to think, well, there's spiritual over here, there's psychological here, there's political over here, and these things are connected. These things are together. And a lot about what Common Sense Rebellion is to have you understand the psychological is connected to the political, is connected to the spiritual. And, a lot of your training, if you're an MD or a PhD, is like, spiritual, it's bad to kind of like say anything bad about the term spiritual because it'd be politically incorrect, but, anything you can't really measure, you're a little uncomfortable around. And I think, spiritual is really a hard word to define. And it's certainly, you can't measure it, but it's, for me, it's important to sort of see what it evokes in you. It's a powerful thing. And for me, a lot of what spirituality means is like the truth of life, okay? And a lot of what it evokes in me, all right, is what do you do with your pain? What do you do with your hurt? What do you do with your emotional difficulties, okay? What do you do with that pain? And, there's really lots of different paths that you can take with pain. You could do self-destructive things or destructive things to other people. You could do what a lot of this culture does, which is deny that there's any kind of pain out there. Or even more so, anesthetize themselves against pain. That's mainly what consumer culture is all about, through alcohol, drugs, but not only that, TV, gambling, everything. For me, really, what the spiritual path is with pain is to do none of those, is to see it as part of life, and to try, at least with yourself, and maybe not with the whole world, but with people you care about, some people, to try to understand it, to try to care about it. And what happens is, if you do that, you get rewarded. Because what happens is you see that pain becomes an energy. It becomes an energy for things like Support Coalition International. It's an energy for Right and Common Sense Rebellion. It's the energy for all kinds of kind of life-affirming things. all right? And that's a very diametrically opposed view, I think, to industrial psychiatry and institutional mental health. They might disagree, but my thinking is there's just two different ways. Their view is to eliminate pain, to create a productive, efficient lifestyle as quickly as possible. My view is very different. Very hard to compromise those views. The other part of spirituality for me is really the issue of arrogance versus humility. Huge spiritual issue. And like I started off at the top of the talk, is that medicine, especially psychiatry, has had a history of taking a look at people who don't fit in a classroom, who don't fit in a job, who don't fit in maybe even in a family. And because they create tension, maybe even havoc, to immediately saying, well, that's enough evidence to say that they have a disorder and that's a disease. For me, it's the height of arrogance. Height of arrogance to say that just because you're in some state of tension, you're in some state of even havoc, that there's something essentially wrong with this person who's creating that. As opposed to humility is that, well, maybe you just don't like that person. That's an okay thing to say. Or maybe you and that person just don't mesh, or maybe your environment is not exactly where this person needs to be. And for me, what a rehumanized culture is, as opposed to what our culture is increasingly becoming, two things should be happening. One is that when you have people in alienating situations, classrooms, jobs, two things should be going on. One is that people who call themselves helpers, and if you're not a helper, okay, but if you're saying you're a parent or a teacher or a counselor, if you're calling yourself a helper, you should be doing two things, one of which would be trying to help these people navigate through these alienating situations without labeling them, without making them feel less than human. The second thing you should be doing, all right, and I have to do this working with teenagers, or else I've got no credibility. And also with adults too, but even more telling, because I mostly work with teens, is that as you're helping them navigate, you're also trying to do what you can to change a culture, change a society, so that there are all alienating environments, that there are some environments that kids can fit in. And that's what a lot of these common sense rebel examples that I describe here, and I have more in the book, are all about. How do you do that? Okay? Thank you. Thanks a lot. Common sense solutions, that's what I'm talking about in Common Sense Rebellion. It's just like people in psychiatry, psychology, people assume who don't have any experience with the business that surely you would have suggested or talked about doing something as common sense about before you put people on psychiatric drugs, but it doesn't happen. And so what people again have known for thousands of years, just common stuff. If you're in a relationship with somebody, family member, spouse, who there's not mutual trust, mutual respect, mutual affection, you're going to have problems, all kinds of problems. And so if you can't work these things out, which sometimes you can't, you have to extricate. And a huge part of common sense is being in situations, to be at least as smart as a plant. A plant moves to where the sun is, right? To move towards places in life. Psychiatrists aren't as smart as plants. They're not. That what you want to do is in your life is you want to move away from people who hate you, who have who you don't trust, and move towards people who you dig and who dig you, who you respect. These are common sense things, right? That's okay. This is a great study. I'll just kind of finish with this, and I've got it in the end chapter of Common Sense Rebellion. It's a Rosenhan study that went on in 1973, where he had a group of folks, 7 or 8, I'm not sure, of folks who went to all 12 different hospitals, and they presented. Each one of these folks were like friends of his, who had never had any kind of psychiatric history, and they went and they presented at psychiatric emergency rooms saying this one symptom: I feel vague, hollow voices. Okay? Every one of them in all of these different hospitals were hospitalized. Okay? Here, that's not the interesting thing. That's not why this study became nationally famous, that these people were able to fool psychiatry. That's not what the big deal was. The big deal was that they were also told, as soon as they got admitted, to go back to acting totally like the way they were, And none of them got released. And the average stay was like 19 days in a hospital. And the patients, the fellow patients, all knew. They were saying, you're all journalists, you're all... the fellow patients knew that they weren't really patients themselves. They knew they were journalists or they were researchers or something like that. And ultimately, when all of them were released, just about every disposition, okay, in the hospital forms was they never admitted we made a mistake. Everyone said schizophrenia in remission. In remission. So that's the Rosenhan study. Thanks. Thank you.